first few months after Walt died, it was sort of like, well, Walt's just away Walt's just away for a while. Walt will be back from a vacation, and then we'll get on with the next things that we're going to do.
The Disney Company was devastated. Without their charismatic leader, many felt Disney World couldn't be built.
It took us about a year to convince Roy O. Disney and the rest of the management of the Walt Disney Company that there was a lot of talent here that had worked with Walt Disney for many years and that we could do this project.
Finally, in 1967, Roy Disney, Walt's brother and business partner, decided to move ahead with Disney World. The first project would be a theme park modeled after Disneyland, but more than twice as large. It would be called the Magic Kingdom. Construction officially began in April of 1969. But the Magic Kingdom didn't happen with a wave of the wand. It was more like a military conquest. In fact, the battle to build Walt Disney World and the Magic Kingdom was commanded by a Navy admiral and an Army general. General Joe Potter had overseen the operation of the Panama Canal and the 1964 World's Fair. And Admiral Joe Fowler had built Disneyland for Walt a decade before.
They were perfect for the job. Joe Fowler was especially perfect from a construction standpoint because he understood how to work with the Imagineers and all the creative talent and all the engineers.
Their first challenge was to convert hundreds of acres of swampy land into rolling hills and sparkling waterways. They started by digging into Bay Lake, 400 acres of reeds, muck, and swamp grass, lined with 14 feet of rotted roots.
They drained the lake and went down and dug out a good layer of muck and mire that was down at the lake bottom.
After 18 months of moving more than 8 million cubic yards of dirt, the largest private construction project in the country, they were ready to pour concrete. But the concrete work wasn't for any of the landmark structures visitors today would recognize. In fact, it wasn't for structures any guests were ever supposed to see. Back during the early days of Disneyland, Walt once saw a Frontierland cowboy sauntering through Tomorrowland, which utterly destroyed the futuristic sci-fi mood. To avoid that kind of culture clash at Walt Disney World, the Imagineers designed a network of tunnels to service the park. They were called utilidors, utility corridors. Because the water table in Central Florida is only 2 feet below ground level, the Imagineers built the utilidors on top of the ground rather than under it.
They are on ground level. They are the first floor of the Magic Kingdom. Then the Magic Kingdom park was built on the second and third stories on top of that.
The Magic Kingdom is actually 14 feet above where the original elevation was.
The utilidors made it possible to walk from one end of the park to the other in just 10 minutes without being seen by guests. The utilidors also hid many of the mundane operations that could break the Disney magic.
They have office buildings, facilities, wardrobe, cafeteria.
The tunnels also housed an underground trash collection system, one of the world's biggest vacuum cleaners.
Our engineers found the Swedish system, the AVAC system, which we incorporated to collect trash pneumatically. You know, like those old department store things where the cashiers would take something and put it in a tube and send it off. Basically, it works the same way, and the trash goes from specified points to a central collection area.
With the site prep and underground foundations laid by General Potter's Army, Admiral Joe Fowler was ready to start building the park itself. His biggest challenge would be what Walt had envisioned as the Magic Kingdom's crowning structure, a towering Cinderella castle. But the castle couldn't be too tall because Florida law required a flashing red light on any structure higher than 200 feet. Fowler's contractors ordered 600 tons of structural steel and began assembling the castle skeleton. Day by day, the girders rose, hoisted into the Florida sky by giant cranes. To speed the progress, they prefabricated sections of the castle. Not just steel framework, but complete towers and turrets, 18 in all. While on the ground, they were sheathed in fiberglass panels molded to look like stone. Real gold topped 3 of the towers. The highest tower of Cinderella Castle was hoisted and fastened in place 18 months after it was begun, in July of 1971. The castle topped out at 189 feet, just below Florida's height limit of 200 feet. But Disney's Imagineers wanted the Magic Kingdom's castle to look much higher, so they worked a little magic of their own. Optical magic.
First perspective is a technique that's been used in filmmaking for many, many years, and it's where you'll take a building and you will scale it differently up close to you. So if you've got a building that's maybe several stories tall, then the windows and the framework will get smaller and smaller. That gives the illusion that the structure is actually bigger than it really is, or further away than it may actually be.
On October 1st, 1971, Roy Disney unveiled Cinderella Castle and the rest of the Magic Kingdom to a crowd of 10,000 people.
Walt Disney World is a tribute to the philosophy and the life of Walter Elias Disney.
Unlike Disneyland's opening 15 years earlier, the event ran like clockwork, proof of both Walt's vision and the Imagineers' technical achievements. But the greatest achievement wasn't creating the park, the tunnels, or even the castle. It was an array of high-tech figures designed by Walt himself 10 years earlier. Disney's contemporary resort was built with modular construction. 9-ton rooms were finished out with built-in furniture 3 miles away, then trucked to the site and slid into place like dresser drawers. Modern marvels, Walt Disney World, will return in a moment. When Walt Disney World opened in 1971, it seemed like the entire East Coast funneled straight into the theme park. Attendance hit 10 million in less than 2 years. People came by the carload to see popular attractions like Jungle Cruise, It's a Small World, and the Hall of Presidents. Like their counterparts at Disneyland, they all had one thing in common. They featured what many people consider Walt's greatest legacy: the robotic figures he called audio animatronics. And they owed their existence to the 1964 New York World's Fair. Back in 1961, when Walt Disney heard that a World's Fair was being planned for New York City, he contracted with several major companies to create rides for the fair.
Walt wanted to be able to develop this, and there was a way to get the sponsorship and some of the money to help develop the ideas that he had.
One idea he'd been working on for years was robotic figures, which he called audio animatronics, or AAs.
He had visions to where if he could build a mechanical, electrical machine and then turn it into a life form that looked realistic and moved you out of that illusion of, well, it's not a machine, but it's got character and it's real and it comes alive.
Walt had built simple pneumatic AA figures into the Enchanted Tiki Room show at Disneyland.
What made it so unique was all the surprises, that you'd be sitting there and all of a sudden the drums would come and the tiki poles would start to animate. And then, of course, the finale when the orchid's up and the stuff and starts singing.
Everything in that theater comes to life. And that was very similar to what he used to do in his animated films, where flowers would sing and birds would talk, etc., and buildings would come to life.
But Walt wanted more. He wanted lifelike human AAs. For years, his Imagineers had been struggling to create an audio animatronic of Walt's favorite president, Abraham Lincoln.
We wanted to bring to the people of today the inspiring words of the man who held this nation together during its moment of greatest crisis, the Civil War.
When Walt started pitching ideas to the World's Fair, one of the World's Fair officials, Robert Moses, was fascinated.
Robert Moses said, "I won't open the fair without Mr. Lincoln."
The trouble was, Lincoln was nowhere close to being operational. The simple system that ran the Tiki Birds wasn't advanced enough for Lincoln. To make him seem human, he would need a far more complex mechanism, and it would have to be packed into a very small space. Lincoln's skull, to be precise. As the fair drew closer and closer, Lincoln still wasn't ready.
Walt was very, very upset with it and told me, he says, "Bobby, I want twice as many motions and half as much weight." Not having ever designed humans or animals, it was like a whole new thing, but which we're used to doing whole new things. I immediately saw it as an airplane fuselage with small bearings, small steel framework, and in 90 days I laid out the entire design.
Lincoln was given an internal framework with 13 main structural units, all moving in dozens of directions. The articulated motions were powered by large pneumatic servo cylinders. Early tests proved the design could work. Still, there were problems.
Walt was pulling out some of the dignitaries from the state of Illinois to where they could come out and preview what Mr. Lincoln was going to look like. Mr. Lincoln stood up and he started giving his speech. And at that time and frame, our hydraulic fluids were red in color. Unfortunately, when he was doing his show, we blew a hydraulic line in the torso of Mr. Lincoln, and then all of a sudden he collapsed, and we had this red dye fluid started to leak through his white shirt. Some of the dignitaries in the audience said, "Oh, you've recreated the assassination of Mr. Lincoln," and Walt wasn't very pleased about that, so from that point on we had to use clear hydraulic fluid.
He made his debut at the World's Fair in April of 1964 to a stunned audience.
There were reports at the New York World's Fair that Mr. Lincoln got up off the stage and shook hands with people. But from the Imagineers that I talked to who were there, that never happened. And he essentially was bolted to the floor for the duration of his run.
Just resonated with people in a way that left them very enthusiastic, not only about Mr. Lincoln, but about seeing entertainment robotics in general.
Now that they could make human figures, Disney's Imagineers created hundreds of AAs.
They were traditionally hydraulic or pneumatic figures. This means that they have either fluid going through tubes at high pressure, that's hydraulic, or pneumatic is air going through tubes at varying pressure.
As the air or fluid flowed at varying pressures, it triggered the actuators, the mechanisms that cause the automatic motions.
We have what we call rotax, which is short for rotary actuators. They do a rotary motion of a wrist twist or torso twist. Then we have linear actuators that will do a linear motion.
Actuators powered even the tiny facial movements that make AAs so convincing.
We have an actuator that we call the pinch actuator, and it pinches the corner of the lips. That when you pronounce certain words, the corners of your mouth will pinch. And then the actuators down off the side is what we call the smile actuators. So when those actuators move up and down, they actually pull the lips back and give the look of the figure smiling. Up at the eyes, we have an actuator that can either be digital or analog that will give you eyes right or left. If they're digital, they're spring-loaded and they will come back to center each time. If they're analog, they will go from point A to B, and we can stop them and control them any range and point we want.
Better control and thus greater realism was always the goal for AAs. But in the early days of Disney World, that realism required a trade-off in speed.
If we wanted to move the arm swing real fast, what would happen was the figure would stop and then it would shake and resonate and go all the way through the whole figure. It looked very unnatural. So what we would do is we had to slow that function down to where it looked fluid and more natural and not resonate and shake. So we always had to sacrifice speed for control, which drove the animators crazy because they wanted speed and still have control.
The Imagineers created a breakthrough in audio animatronics in the 1980s. By adding a new circuit called compliance, they were able to control the amount of force pushing or pulling on a movement.
We have built-in compliance in the human body to where when my brain says stop, maybe the inertia makes my arm overshoot a little bit and then comes back to where I told it to stop, you know, but it looked very natural because that's how the human body works. We did the same thing with an electronic circuit and either pressure transducers or a mechanical Hall effect sensor. We can get that fast speed now and then it will naturally overshoot and come back that looks very realistic and